The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Emerging Geopolitical Realities and Opportunities for the Global South. The once unipolar world order, led by the US and its Western allies, has been shaken by the rise of the Global South. The growing influence of Asian giants China and India, and of regional powers such as Indonesia, South Africa and Brazil, has created a new multipolarity. Today, nations of the Global South are becoming increasingly visible on the world stage, forming new blocs for cooperation and asserting shared interests. Yet amidst these opportunities lie challenges, including weak government institutions and geopolitical conflict, economic and environmental crises. To learn more about these realities and what they mean for the Global South, tune into our live debate, bringing your questions and comments for our expert panel.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour on this Democracy Forum debate, Emerging Geopolitical Realities and Opportunities for the Global South. Yes, indeed, with the army being called onto the streets of Washington, D.C., and the leaders of Russia and America about to cut a deal on Ukraine, with much of the developing nations of the Global South being hit by crippling tariffs from the world's richest and most powerful country, there are indeed emerging geopolitical realities. What exactly are they, and where does the opportunity lie? To reveal all, we have an incredibly wise and informed panel: Portia, Roelofs, Jorge, Heine, Darius, Nasimi, and Banik. And before we begin our discussion, I'm asking the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which we have called to investigate the evolving relationship, both economic and political, between the developed world and countries recognized collectively as the Global South. This is a very timely issue, made all the more urgent in response to America's imposition of unprecedented tariffs as a foreign policy tool and the consequent disruption of global trade. I'm most grateful to the team at the Democracy Forum for planning this event, and I'm delighted that we will be joined by such an eminent panel of speakers. I look forward to hearing their views and to the discussion which will follow under the moderation of Humphrey Hawksley. I'm very glad that he has agreed to chair the panel today. In attempting to define the extent and diversity of national interests represented by the collective sense of a Global South, it's worth recalling the inaugural summit of the Virtual Voice of the Global South in 2023, which attracted 125 countries. Speaking to the summit, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was hosting the event, suggested, I quote, "Most of the global challenges have not been created by the Global South, but they affect us more." And he added, "The people of Global South should no longer be excluded from the fruits of development. Together, we must attempt to redesign global political and financial government." And at the summit of the BRICS group of developing economies, which met at Rio de Janeiro last month, together with our partner states forming the effective leadership of the Global South, the attendees took the opportunity to refocus their collective purpose, particularly the need to reform global governance and a comprehensive overhaul of the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank. I quote, "So they might reflect the realities of the 21st century rather than the post-war era." And interviewed in advance of the summit, the former foreign policy advisor to the president of Brazil, Celso Amorim, reflected the widely held belief among the summit attendees that China and the developing nations are today the main defenders of the multilateral system. I quote, "What's fundamental is to have rules which are multilaterally accepted," he argues. But taking a cautious view of the opportunities for countries of the Global South collectively to promote multilateralism. The former Deputy Director of the IMF, Mohammed El Erian, writes, I quote, "The notion that in response to actual and potential threats, a large grouping of these countries can quickly achieve strategic autonomy and prosper is unrealistic." And as Sarang Shidor of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington suggests, I quote, "The Global South exists not as a coherent, organized grouping, so much as a geopolitical fact." And noting the 70th anniversary of the birth of the Global South movement at the Conference of Afro-Asian Solidarity, the Bandung Conference, was not officially celebrated in April this year. The Economist claims that, I quote, "This year's non-event is a sign of the times. It shows how countries of the Global South have evolved along starkly different lines, and suggests that the leaders of the Global South have long claimed a new multipolar world is an opportunity for change. But individual countries, rather than collectives, may end up having the most clout. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. Individual countries or a collective or a network, the reality of the 21st century rather than of the post-war era. Our first speaker is Dr. Portia Roelofs, convener of King's College London's Global South Research Group. Her main and very important work has been in Africa, and her latest book is Good Governance in Nigeria, Rethinking Accountability and Transparency in the 21st Century. She argues that the strengthening of the Global South, that incidentally used to be referred to as the third world or developing world, does offer opportunities, particularly about a new conception of democracy, which is a term that has become very much an ideology of the developed West. But does democracy work for poorer societies? What is the reality and what are the opportunities now? Portia Roelofs, tell us what you know.
Hi, thank you so much, Humphrey, for that very kind introduction. Can I just check you can hear me and see me okay?
Yes, we can.
And also thank you to the Democracy Forum and Lord Bruce for hosting this discussion, which I'm really excited to be a part of. Also, just to say up front, so yes, I'm co-convener of the Global South Research Group at King's College London, where we have a great group of scholars working on really diverse topics. Obviously, I'm from and based in the UK in the global north, so I don't seek to in any way speak on behalf of or kind of exhaust the possibilities of kind of global South experience. But I guess I'm here as a really privileged scholar who's been able to kind of engage with the conversations and the traditions of thought going on in global South countries, which has really been a kind of eye-opening and really rich experience for me. So I'm kind of here to share that. And so what I wanted to talk about a bit today is, so what is the reality we find ourselves in with regards to democracy? And so I want to start with a kind of statistic that Stefan Limberg from the VDEM project, so the Varieties of Democracy project, shared just recently, which is if you look at the portion of the world, the kind of portion of world GDP which is controlled by autocratic states, it's now reached 50%. So in terms of the kind of economic might of democracy as an idea or as a system, we see that kind of shifting back to, I think he says, at no point since 1974 have we seen this kind of economic domination of non-democratic kind of countries across the world. And I think this is a challenge for not only the kind of practice of democracy as a political system, but also the legitimacy of the idea of democracy, the idea of kind of popular rule or fair processes, or all of those kind of attached possible ideas of what democracy could mean. But I think it also poses a real opportunity, because for a long time, the the kind of ideals and ideas of democracy have been trumpeted by a pretty limited set of kind of Western-based institutions for quite limited and kind of, in many cases, problematic interests and ends. And what we have the chance to do now is to look at how democracy is being practiced and envisioned by a much wider selection of kind of people and groups and actors across the global south. And that this is actually an opportunity to really kind of refresh and nourish our conception of what democracy could be in practice and kind of rejuvenate democracy going forward. So I'm going to bring in 3 points from 3 countries, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Pakistan. So just some examples of kind of where I see this happening. So first of all, in Nigeria, which I look at for my own work, I went in there curious about, you know, we all agree that corruption is a bad thing, and the discussion of democracy and politics, both about Nigeria, but also within Nigeria, among Nigerian kind of political actors, is that corruption is to be opposed. But what this often leaves out is actually what is our kind of substantive conception of what should be there in its place. When we say that politicians and governments should be accountable and transparent, what does that actually mean? And so the sort of dominant account of what that looks like in governance reforms promoted by the erstwhile Department for International Development by the UK, the World Bank, the kind of now defunct USAID, is a very technocratic, data-based, kind of document-focused conception of accountability and transparency. And in my work, what I saw on the ground, how people were actually being held to account and how politicians were actually being made transparent, was a much more socially embedded understanding. So when I looked at effective local leaders who did have legitimacy, when they talked about accountability, they talked about things like accessibility. So maintaining spaces for face-to-face spontaneous interactions with members of the public, with citizens, with different social groups. And that was seen as a much more powerful space where you could really hold people to account through kind of social sanction and having to account for your actions kind of in front of an audience. Much more kind of visceral than purely kind of publishing budgets, putting documents online, that sort of thing. And similarly for transparency, when people saw that there was a kind of increase in the standard best practice of good governance, which you often see with this kind of Southwestern, the kind of Lagos model, which I study in Nigeria, which emerged from the Southwestern states around Lagos. People looked at that and yet they were a little bit skeptical. They said, okay, you're publishing the budget, you're using these kind of international processes of accounting and audit, but if that's not twinned with this transparency that is kind of about your social relations, your loyalty, your obligations, then it's very, very difficult to locate like kind of powerful political.
We seem to have lost Portia for the moment, talking about the new style of democracy. Portia, can I interrupt you for a second there, because we lost you for 30 seconds. So if you could spool back and then continue, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So just to wrap up on that point on Nigeria. So from Nigeria, we see, in contrast to the quite technocratic understandings of accountability and transparency that are promoted by kind of international institutions, there are these alternative ideas of kind of accessibility and transparency in people that we can see as a more socially embedded vision of good governance that we can borrow from, learn from, and look at the ways that it's more universally applicable. I see I've only got about a minute left, so I'm going to just go briefly through the kind of Tanzania example and then the Pakistan example as possible ways forward. So the Tanzania case, we see when we have rising authoritarianism, as we have seen in Tanzania under the rule of President Magufuli, what has been the way of counteracting that? What has been the resistance to that? So here I borrow from Dan Padgett's work on Chadema, the opposition party in Tanzania. And again, he shows that they've been using critiques of anti-corruption to bolster their kind of claim to democracy and critique power. But they haven't been using it in this kind of, we want a clean government, we want technocratic government, let's get these bureaucrats behaving. When they use the critique of anti-corruption, he terms it as a kind of radical Republican critique. So he locates for us alternative visions of democracy based much more on a kind of resistance to domination and oligarchy. So again, looking at the kind of Tanzanian debates around democracy and finding kind of fresh insights there. And then finally, to just tie this all together, something we're increasingly doing in the kind of academic study of political ideas of democracy is really extending our gaze from just looking at elites and political leaders and international institutions to the kind of margins. And so how is democracy being imagined or envisioned by those who kind of are most marginalized in our systems? So in this, I'm looking at work by people like Humaira Iqtidar, which draws on oral histories with refugees and migrants from tribal areas in Pakistan and builds up from their discussions, how do they envision justice? And how do they envision justice as functioning in the context of kind of a more receptive engagement with migration and kind of cross-border movement? And in this work, she discusses the concept of haq, which is a less state-centric way of thinking about what different moral obligations or political obligations might be in the context of migration, and ways that we can have a kind of just response to the issue of migration at a kind of community level without necessarily relying on kind of quite kind of state-centric discussions of what it means to ethically engage with migration. So there we go. We've got 3 examples of how we could rethink and reimagine bits of democratic practice or ideas of kind of just democracy from Nigeria, from Tanzania and Pakistan. And so hopefully this opens up the discussion a little bit more of what do we learn about democracy? How can we re-envision it from a kind of global South perspective? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Portia. Can I just try to nail down the nub of this? Is that what you've seen and what you're arguing is that the geopolitical reality that's emerging now is allowing the global South to rethink its systems of government?
Yeah, so sometimes you talk about the kind of the end of history era from the kind of 1990s into the 2000s, where it looked like the global system of international institutions had sort of found a final answer to what democracy was. And it was just putting it into practice and it was consolidating it. And what I'm saying is that if we look at the way that democracy is being practiced in the global South, we actually have these opportunities in new ways of doing that. Would say back 20 years ago, would the Western observers of democracy accept that what you're talking about is actual democracy? Like they have elections, they have rival political parties, all of the rest of it, or has that era gone? So yeah, I think a lot of this discussion is if there's so much more to democracy than just kind of elections, and that needs to be situated in a broader environment and practice of accountability, kind of justice, transparency. And maybe what went wrong was when just focusing on elections and issues of kind of public financial management, we lost sight of what are the democratic values that actually enable those systems to be legitimate in the eyes of those kind of on the ground. And by missing that, people are turning away from these systems, thinking maybe there's some better alternatives somewhere else.
So just before I let you go, we have in the public's mind, for want of a better word, we have Western democracy, and then we have this authoritarianism. What you're described for us now is a sort of middle way where people get on with sorting out the best systems that they can in order to get accountability and transparency.
Yeah, I would actually say that through looking at ideas like accessibility and transparency in people, we achieve much better the kind of ideals that we talked about under the Western system of kind of popular sovereignty, holding leaders to account. I think we had the right goals, but maybe we didn't actually always have the right institutions that enabled us to achieve that.
And you've seen it firsthand. I think many of our panel have seen what you're talking about firsthand. I've certainly seen what you've said in Africa firsthand there. Can I give you a question by Mohammed Ismail? How might geopolitical competition among major industrial Western powers spill over into the global South and impact stability there? I'm thinking particularly the system that you've just described.
Yeah, so I think what's happening is prior to our current era of kind of instability, the Western powers were much more speaking with one voice. And I think what's happening now is really opening up global South countries to exert agency in terms of kind of choosing what elements of the international system they work with. So one example that I've seen or discussed kind of from my informants is on issues like climate finance. If you look at the civil servants in Nigeria who are tasked with engaging with international systems, they are much more savvy than and much more kind of skeptical than they were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And when the international kind of community come to them and say, oh, we've got this scheme, you've got to jump through X, Y, Z hoop if you want our money, I think countries like Nigeria and other global South, they're sitting back and they're saying, actually, we need to see from you that this scheme is going to work for us before we kind of jump. You say jump and we say how high and fill out all of your forms and then wait for money that never appears. I think there's a much kind of stronger agency among global South countries who are really being quite canny in terms of how they engage with the international system.
Portia, thank you very much for that. We are now going to take your argument, what you've illustrated us, to a man who knows intimately, I think, about what you're talking about. Our next panelist is Dr. Jorge Heine. Until very recently, a couple of months ago, research professor at Boston University's School of Global Studies, and he has served as an ambassador for Chile to China, India, and South Africa, as well as working as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. So he does know his stuff, or he should. He's written extensively on what we're debating, and his latest book is The Non-Aligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition. And within it, he explains a trend of active non-alignment. Is that what Portia was talking about? What is it? And is that an opportunity? Dr. Jorge Heine, give us your argument.
Thank you, Humphrey. And I would like to thank the Democracy Forum and Lord Bruce for the kind invitation to share this panel with you. So let me lay out the argument that we set out in our recent book published by Polity Press. The argument is this. The world is undergoing what has been defined as a polycrisis. In the past 5 years, we have had the pandemic, we have had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we have had the war in Gaza, and we have recently had the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and we have, of course, the Sudan war, with the climate change threat looming over humanity as it does, with financial instability across many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, a very dire picture. As Lenin once said, there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And that is the time we're living now. So in that context, I would argue that the key dynamic, despite the many things that are going on, the key dynamic is still provided by US-China competition, the two biggest powers, the two superpowers in today's world. And they are competing, as the United States and the Soviet Union did in the 50s and 60s, for the hearts and minds of the peoples across the South. In that context, again, to quote Lenin, what is to be done? And what we argue with my colleagues, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, that the answer to that is what we have called active non-alignment. What do we mean by that? Why should countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America embrace that notion? It is a notion that takes up a page from the non-aligned movement of the 50s and 60s, but brings it up to date to the realities of the 21st century, where we have the Asian giants, China and India, where we have countries like Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, that has been mentioned, Indonesia, that command many resources. We have new multilateral banks like the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank. So the South is in a very different position today than it was 50 years ago. Some people have said that the main geoeconomic development of the past 20 years has been the shift from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific, where economic growth is taking place at a pace and at a rate that is not happening in the North Atlantic. And in that context, it is that we argue that countries in the global South should take up a foreign policy approach that is active non-alignment. What is meant by that? By that we mean putting these countries' interests front and center, not give in to the demands from Washington or from Beijing to align themselves with one or another of these powers, and in turn, what we call play the field. That is, because there is this competition between China and the United States, this opens possibilities. This opens new venues for these countries to make the most of this competition. And here there's an important difference between today's situation and the situation that obtained in the days of the Cold War. The difference is this. The Soviet Union was a significant military, ideological, space, nuclear power. But its economy was much smaller than that of the United States. It was also a closed economy. This meant that the Soviet Union really couldn't compete in terms of trade, finance, or investment across the countries of what was then known as the Third World. Today, the situation is very different. The Chinese economy in PPP terms is already bigger than that of the United States. It represents something like 19% of world GDP. The US represents around 25%. This means that China is able to compete with the United States on an economic basis in a way that the Soviet Union was not. This makes it possible for countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America to play one of the powers against the other. And that is what we are seeing. For South America today, the number one trading partner is China. It's not the United States. Countries in Africa are doing more and more business with China. And this is what leads to the present situation. In terms of foreign policy tactics, this means that these countries have to hedge their bets. You do not say, we will side with Trump or we will side with Xi Jinping. What you say is, well, it depends on the issue. We will evaluate each opportunity on its own terms. And let me give you an example. Peru recently inaugurated the port of Chancay, the most modern and advanced port on the Pacific coast of South America. This was a private initiative that was taken by a Peruvian private company originally to US investors and to European investors, none of which were interested. It was a Chinese company, Costco, that took up the opportunity and built this port in association with this Peruvian company. So that is what we mean by, playing the field and look out for the many opportunities that exist. So we originally posited this argument in 2020 for Latin America in an earlier book that we argued that active non-alignment was the best alternative for Latin America in a very difficult situation when Latin America was hit by a triple whammy: the pandemic, the ensuing economic recession, and the policies of the Trump administration that put the countries between a rock and a hard place. We argued that in those very difficult circumstances, Latin America had to embrace active non-alignment. What happened later with the events that I already mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza, BRICS expansion, is that active non-alignment has spread from Latin America to Africa and to Asia as well. And that is the argument that we develop in our book. Basically, what we're saying is that this is at the time of the global South, which has emerged with great force. We're seeing it today. Which are the countries that President Trump has targeted for the highest tariffs in the world? Brazil and India, two of the leading members of the BRICS. This is not a coincidence. It means that this north-south cleavage that we mentioned before has become perhaps the most significant cleavage in today's world. And accordingly, for these countries, it is active non-alignment, the foreign policy of choice. Thank you.
Clarify the group of the active non-aligned that you're talking about, that excludes the US, it excludes China. Does it exclude Russia? And where does that leave the European Union?
Sure. Well, our argument is that this is a foreign policy for the developing world, mainly the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. China, of course, is in competition with the United States. So I would argue it is not really part of the global South, although obviously it takes policy positions that often coincide with those of the global South. And he has a very, very important point about the BRICS. The BRICS, of course, because of the membership of Russia and of China, is not a group of the global South. Russia and China are not part of the global South. But I would argue, because of the policies they advocate and the positions they take, it is a platform for the global South in practice. So it's an important distinction that needs to be made. And I would emphasize that the recent policies of the Trump administration and the very high tariffs it has been imposing on many countries across the world has given an additional impetus to the BRICS. President Lula of Brazil has been on the phone with President Xi, has been on the phone with Prime Minister Modi, and we're seeing a strengthening of the BRICS in recent weeks.
Could I put in there, because we are going into this realm from Prashant Kumar, might China use the Global South grouping or concept to push its own agenda under the guise of a common cause?
Well, obviously, China is pushing its own interests in this. China is not in the charity business. The question is this: given that China at this point is offering, policies that are very different from that of, the West in terms of trade, in terms of believing in free trade, in terms of investment and so on. Obviously, it offers opportunities that are not being offered by many Western countries, and those opportunities are being used by countries in the global South.
So this is and interesting. Very quickly, when you talk about actively non-aligned, yes, is this synonymous with multipolar?
No, it's not synonymous with multipolar. It is synonymous with a world in which the central dynamic is given by the competition between the United States and China. In that regard, the choice is not siding with Washington or siding with Beijing. The choice is siding with your own interests, putting them front and center, and make the most of this competition for your own advantage.
Okay, and just what is the difference between that and this phrase multipolar policies that we're hearing about? Particularly India's a leader in this.
Well, I would argue that in de facto, India is going back to its non-aligned tradition. As we all know, Mr. Nehru invented the term non-alignment. India calls it in a different way. It speaks about multi-alignment. But I would argue in the end, it ends up being very much the same. Your own interests front and center. In India's policies in the last few years, in its position it's taken on the war in Ukraine, for example, is a very good example of that.
Thank you very much. Stay with us. We are now going to our next speaker, Darius Nasimi, who's founder of the UK Central Asia Business Council, and we're moving into Central Asia because I think in an earlier era, this was talked about as the Second World, those countries once under Soviet control. And there's much reporting, say, about Afghanistan because the West tried to run it for 20 years. But what about those 5 countries of Central Asia and associated countries, 90 million people, an area half the size of Europe and the United States, and we don't hear much about them in this debate. Darius Nasimi, what is the emerging geopolitical reality in Central Asia, and is there an opportunity there?
Thank you very much, Humphrey. I just wanted to discuss, going back to the first point, why is Central Asia in the periphery? But not just Central Asia, also countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and other countries as well, post-Soviet republics. But also why I think Afghanistan is an exception as well. But I want to start off by saying that Central Asia is often overlooked in discussions about the Global South and remains on the periphery of Global South discussions because of its historical context as part of the former Soviet Union and its subsequent development trajectory, which placed it outside of the typical post-colonial narratives that shape the concept. which differed from many nations typically associated with the global south. And I think this has led to a different positioning in global discourse, because while Central Asia does share some characteristics with the global south, such as its position in the global economy and a history of dependency, I think its post-Soviet identity and evolving relationships with different global actors makes it a complex case that doesn't neatly fit into existing frameworks. So first of all, unlike many nations in the global south, Central Asia was part of the USSR until 1991, placing them within that second world during the Cold War. But this historical experience differs significantly from the typical narratives of post-colonialism and decolonization that inform other countries in the global south. And I think the region's history meant that it was not as actively involved in the non-aligned movement or the broader discussions about third world solidarity that helped shape the global south discourse. And Central Asia was also not directly subjected to colonialism. They were instead part of that Soviet Union system. So it means that their development path and their relationship with the West and other developing nations was slightly different than other countries in the global south. The other area is also the geopolitical complexity and great power competition. So Central Asia's location between Russia, China, and Afghanistan places it in a complex geopolitical space influenced by these major powers. And it leads to a focus on regional dynamics and security concerns, which complicates, again, its categorization. The economic factors, some Central Asian countries are classified as lower middle income, but others like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have benefited from significant oil and gas exports, which puts them in a slightly higher income bracket than other countries in the global south. And that's why Central Asia is seeking to improve its connectivity with global markets, particularly in the energy sector, infrastructure development, trade routes, and a broader ideological discussion. The lack of regional identity. So Central Asia faces that challenge, making it harder to integrate into the broader global south. And that's why Central Asia is trying to diversify its partnerships, moving beyond just relying traditionally on Russia but also engaging with the West and with the international community. But I also want to focus, before I go into Afghanistan, a few of the shared characteristics with the global south. Economically, Central Asia is in the same position, despite the lack of its colonial past and a history of being marginalized in the global political economy. The economic dependency, like many other global south nations, Central Asian economies are reliant on the export of raw materials and commodities, which makes them vulnerable to price fluctuations and also global economic shocks. Governance challenges, there are issues around democracy and human rights, as the previous speakers mentioned, and the region faces that similar to other parts of the global south. But I do believe that the Central Asia is often overlooked and parts of Eurasia as well within the global south. And some scholars, that's why they argue for a more fluid and expansive understanding of the term. And now moving on to why Afghanistan, on the other hand, has not been on the periphery as much as Central Asia, because I do think that Afghanistan is an exception, even though geographically it is part of Central Asia. It's often discussed separately because of its prolonged conflict, its position as a buffer zone, the humanitarian crisis, and then the Soviet invasion in 1979, the Mujahideen, the civil war, and then the Taliban, and then the NATO presence and the involvement of these international actors. So it has a more unique situation, which is discussed in relation to security and development challenges. But also, I don't think Afghanistan has just been part of Central Asia. I think it's also been very closely associated with South Asia, which is why I, on another note, have been recently appointed as the Afghanistan lead within the South Asian Heritage Month. So as the center of both Central and South Asia, it's kind of been a fusion of different cultures and languages, religions, and traditions. But in conclusion, just to wrap up, I think there are lots of shifting dynamics. Central Asia is experiencing a major geopolitical shift with China's influence also growing, and also the region's ties with the Euro and the Euro-Atlantic community also playing a role here. And I think these changes could lead to a greater focus on Central Asia within the context of the US, but also China and the Global South discourse. And just on a personal note, I've been to Uzbekistan a few times, and also Tajikistan, Samarkand and Bukhara, and I could see that the two countries that are now predominantly the main trading partners of that country in Central Asia is the US and China. So there is a move to reduce its traditional reliance on Russia and obviously, the former USSR, which is what it was part of.
Darius, thank you very much. Just very, very quickly, in Central Asia, is there that movement or evolvement that we heard about from Portia of different systems of transparency and accountability apart from holding elections evolving?
Yeah, I think, political systems take time to evolve, but also to reform itself. But I do definitely believe that in the case of Uzbekistan, the current leader of the government is different to the former leader, which I think it was Karimov, because he was part of the communist government. And now the government is slightly increasing its freedom of speech and freedom of religion as well.
So stuff is changing. I just want to, before we go to our final speaker, I just want to bring back Portia and Jorge just for a second. Portia, do you recognize or do you know that in Central Asia there's anything going on there like what you described to us, or is it a world apart? Just a yes or no, really, on it.
If I can squeeze in a couple more words, yes or no. What I've found is that in all over the world, people have found ways of holding their leaders to account. And often we haven't had the vocabulary to quite make that visible or understand what's going on. But nowhere in the world do people just lie down and say, fine, do whatever to us, we'll just submit. So I think being more attentive to, in each different country, how have they found those kind of vernacular democratic ways of holding power to account? That's always a fascinating process wherever it is.
Okay, that's great. And Jorge, do you think that Central Asia is part of what you were talking about, that the group of the actively non-aligned?
Well, I would argue that Central Asia is very much part of the Global South. That's the first point. And I would argue that what we are seeing there in terms of the choices they are making are very much along those lines as well in terms of active non-alignment. If I can make a final point, I would argue that the distinction, that the cleavage between democracy and authoritarianism, that was something very much emphasized by President Biden during his term in office, is now really becoming somewhat obsolete if we look at what is happening in the United States and elsewhere. And I would argue that the main cleavage in today's world is not between democracy and authoritarianism. It is between North and South, between the global North and the global South.
That's it. We have a question which I'm going to bring in afterwards from somebody saying, why do we never talk of the global North? But before we go there, I want to come to our final speaker, Dr. Dan Banik, a professor of political science, director of the Oslo Sustainability Development Goals at the University of Oslo. He also holds posts at Stanford University and at the China Agricultural University in Beijing. And his many book titles, they include The Democratic Dividend, The Legal Empowerment Agenda, Starvation and India's Democracy. He has heard firsthand the voices of what we're now calling the Global South. Are we at a tipping point? Dr. Dan Banik, what is your view?
Well, thank you, Humphrey. Thanks to the Democracy Forum for inviting me. Well, what is certainly true is we're certainly hearing much more about this term, the Global South. It's no longer developing countries, the third world. Everybody's talking about the Global South. And what I found fascinating is when Jorge said that China is not a part of the Global South. Chinese, most people in China say they're certainly a part of the Global South. So we're seeing very different understandings of what this term means. Since we don't have that much time, I'm not going to get into details. But what I do notice is that there is a project, if you can call it that, where it's somewhat unified in the sense that there's a feeling among these so-called global South actors about a sense of unfairness, that they're growing. Most predictions, economic predictions for 2050 show that most of the growth, most of the jobs are going to be in the so-called global South. These economies are huge. A lot of interesting innovation is being undertaken in these economies, and yet the liberal international order is unfair. They demand much more influence. They want to be much more assertive. They want to create new institutions, whether they're successful in the long run, whether these institutions can replace the Western institutions, that's another matter. But what I do notice is if you look at some of these recent G20 meetings, and G20 has become, this group of 20 countries has become very important because the last 4 countries that held the presidency have been from the global South: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa. They've been articulating some of the needs that are directly related to development, poverty reduction, climate adaptation, but also much needed finance for sustainable development. And the feeling is that the global North is not really interested in these issues. And that is why there is some sort of a coherence or convergence on some of these demands. But this does not mean that everything is fine. But what we do see is a further cementing or strengthening of the so-called South-South cooperation. Much so, this was happening, of course, before the pandemic, but it has become even more stable, I would say, following the pandemic, because here you see countries like China doing stuff that the global North has neglected since the 1960s, infrastructure building, particularly in Latin America and in Africa. You see nobody else really plugging that gap. The US and the EU talk a lot about infrastructure building, but they're not really doing much. It is China and the Belt and Road Initiative. You see India, the world's pharmacy, making available cheap, affordable, generic drugs that many countries can afford. And without India, it would be very difficult to get hold of vaccines and drugs. The same goes for technology transfers, for many issues that the global South is really interested in, that other countries in the global South can provide. And I think South-South is becoming much more of a stronger sort of an entity. But as I said earlier, this does not mean that everything is fine. And here we see certain aspects of this global South that is often not talked about by people, by countries in the global South, and that has to do with intra-global South rivalry. India and China don't see eye to eye on lots of issues. They have border disputes, trade disputes. We see institutions that are not necessarily robust. The BRICS that Jorge mentioned does not really have a permanent secretariat. So there are numerous challenges. What about Russia? Why is Russia positioning itself as a global South actor? So you have a watering down sometimes of what the global South means. Sometimes you have people questioning, do these big actors like China and India and Brazil, are they really representing the smaller countries in the global South? So lots and lots of issues there. But there's one final point that I'd like to mention here, and this goes to what Jorge was talking about in terms of active non-alignment. I think playing the field was working out really well for a long time until Trump's tariffs, punishing India last week with an additional 25% for buying oil from Russia. Before that, I would actually argue with Jorge, I would agree with Jorge. But now I think you have many countries like India being pushed to take sides. And what India will do in the next few weeks, the next few months, is going to be pretty important. Whether it will side with the United States and stop buying oil from Russia, or whether it'll enter into an even stronger alliance with China, that is going to be fascinating. So I see lots and lots of challenges, but huge opportunities for development, for climate cooperation, but also financing for sustainable development. Thank you.
And thank you very much. We have a question in which I'm going to throw back at you because Dan Krogon says, why do we never hear reference to the global north? You and your other panelists have mentioned it a few times, but you mentioned there about the global north neglecting what developing nations needed to develop. Is this still the case? In which case, what are their interests in the global south? What is the north's interest in the south?
So one way of looking at it is from my own country, Norway, where increasingly most of the political debate is on climate, because that is what worries us. It is about access to cheap electric cars, combating pollution. So in a way, to simplify this, Humphrey, you could say these are somewhat higher level needs. And when I speak to my colleagues and students in China or in India, in many parts of Africa, they say that what we really need is some of the basics. We need infrastructure, we need economic growth, we need jobs, we need poverty reduction. And some of these higher level needs that the global north is pushing, it's not like we're not interested. It's just that we don't have the basics in place and the global north is not providing the money. So to sum it up, Humphrey, I think it is about addressing the historical injustices. So the global north has polluted. Now it is about time they paid. And that is why there's a lot of focus in the global south on the loss and damage fund. Provide money. Aid from the global north is shrinking. There's just not enough money. So there's a lot of
money
rhetoric.
Or is it investment? Because
both. I mean, foreign aid has just gone. I mean, your own country has slashed foreign aid. So has the United States. The US aid has been dismantled. So, and in most of these UN negotiations, the global north is not very forthcoming. And so that is where China and India and the others have to step up.
And let's now open it to the panel, because we've got a couple of other points that have come up that I want to nail down. But firstly, on this issue of the global north, Dan, just to finish up, and then I'd like to go around. Has the global north got it wrong for decades and decades, in that China is coming in, building bridges and whatever, and then the elections and the human rights come much later on? Has it got it wrong, and has China
Absolutely.
got it right?
Absolutely. And so when President Biden talked about Build Back Better World, when the EU talks about the Global Gateway Project, it's all about infrastructure building in Africa. However, if you read the fine print, they say very explicitly, it is about combating the rise of China, which I think is a very silly thing to say. It should be much more articulated as being interested, genuinely interested in promoting infrastructure development in the global south.
Portia, do you agree with that?
China.
Portia, do you agree with Dan?
Yeah, I think we just have to remember that the high point of democracy promotion by the West and the rest of the world was as part of the war on terror, and also came at the same time that multilateral Western-led institutions like the World Trade Organization were pushing things like Tariffs, which is a trade-related intellectual property rights, which involved profound control over global South countries' economies to make them more porous and more accessible to Western capital. So I think we need to just remember, like when we say the West pushes democracy, it pushes democracy when it is compatible with a set of economic arrangements that were largely pro-Western as well. That's not to say that donors didn't do great work on kind of demand for good governance, but I think we just need to also be a little bit skeptical or critical about that kind of the framing of the question.
Well, Jorge, you look as if you're a generation that lived through Operation Condor and the various attempts to install democracy in Latin America. How do you sit on this argument?
Well, I think we are living in a world turned upside down. What we are seeing today in Brazil, for example, on the part of the United States, is not democracy promotion, it is autocracy promotion. The United States is backing Mr. Bolsonaro, the former president who attempted a military coup a couple of years ago. And that is the reason the United States imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil. So it seems to me we're a long way from the years of democracy promotion. It's a very different world today. The second point I'd like to make is that what we are seeing is in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, what governments, what people are interested in is development. They are tired of lectures about the nature of democracy and so on and so forth that they were hearing from visiting authorities from Europe and North America. They are keen on investment, as Dan said, on trade, on job creation. And I would say that China has been much more effective in that, in putting development front and center in its foreign policy, rather than morality lectures.
Could I just come back to Dan for a second on this? And all of you, if you can think about this, is the South, whatever we want to call it, does it have the competence and the sophistication to set up the sort of networks that the West set up after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods, the NATO, the European Union, those sort of things? And if they can't do that, will it survive as a sort of grouping entity? Dan, quickly.
So yes, they have the expertise, but they need to be much more unified. They need to talk to each other and agree. I think at the moment, I noticed that there's a huge competition for being leader of the global South. You know, who's going to actually be the leader? Is it India? Is it China? Who's going to push this agenda? But if you look at it from an individual country level, China has been exceptionally good, Humphrey, at promoting relational power. They've been building power, relations through invitations and workshops and just being on the African continent for 50 years or more. Yeah, so it's not like they just came yesterday. Yeah. And I think that is extremely important.
So we can't exclude, as has been argued in this panel, we can't exclude China from this group. Darius, do you see that they have the sophistication to set up the sort of networks needed?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring Afghanistan into this. I was recently reading the BBC Farsi news, and I think there was an article about how Russia and China are now competing for resources from Afghanistan. And because the Afghanistan is very rich in natural resources and minerals, and I think this is just an example that I do believe that the global South, especially countries like Afghanistan, we need the support of the Western world, and we need the support of the international community on a humanitarian level, but also in terms of security and development and growth.
Okay, so you need this. I just want to go around very quickly and in a couple of words, starting with Portia. What are the global realities now, and what are the opportunities?
I think we just have to be really attentive and curious to how democracy is being practiced and envisioned in places that we've often written off as just kind of beyond the pale, not worth thinking about. I think all of these different locations, we need to really change that kind of mode of engagement as Westerners, as Brits, and start to realize we can learn from them.
Thank you very, very much. Jorge, the reality and the opportunity.
Yes, the reality is, and in response to your earlier question, we are seeing the emergence of the institutions that you allude to: the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, are responses from the South to the challenges of development. So I am optimistic about that. There is a new reality out there, and there are enormous opportunities for developing nations.
Darius?
I don't think that the global South, earlier you mentioned about the global North and also the Second World War, I don't think it has the capacity to grow and build itself without the support of the whole world.
Okay, thank you. Dan, finish us off.
The reality is that some countries have a cruel choice. They have to make a decision in terms of alliances. That playing the field, I think, is no longer going to be the case as easy as it has been for many. So there's going to be a cruel choice. But there are numerous opportunities in terms of development, in terms of frugal innovation, cheap solutions, in terms of access to goods and services, and not least infrastructure and education, thanks to South-South cooperation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Time's winged chariot is attacking us, and we are out of time. I think we concluded, and I think, thank goodness, there was some disagreement, which we enjoy in a good, healthy debate. Our next Democracy Forum is on August the 26th, another Global South theme, it looks like, in the light of American tariffs. What is the future of Europe-Asia trade? That's an interesting one. And on September the 10th, navigating the future of democracy in the age of artificial intelligence and digital governance. That'll be a good one. Thank you very much to our panel, Portia, Roelofs, Jorge, Heine, Darius, Nasimi, and Dan Banik. Thank you to everyone at the Democracy Forum involved in making our fascinating debates happen. And until next time, everyone, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.